The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 4. The Truth About Palestine. Arabs insist that Palestine belongs to them as descendants of the original Palestinians, and that Israel does not exist. Israel is not recognized as a sovereign state in Saudi Arabian textbooks, and its name does not appear on any map but only the name Palestine, presented as a Muslim country occupied by foreigners who defile its Muslim holy places. The occupation of Palestine is portrayed as the most crucial problem of the Arabs and Muslims, who should all join forces for the total liberation of Palestine. Israel was also missing from the map of Palestine displayed behind Secretary General Kofi Annan during his UN speech celebrating solidarity with the Palestinian people on November 29th, 2005. About 4 million Palestinians are registered as refugees with the United Nations Relief Works Agency, of which 33% live inside UNRWA's 59 refugee camps throughout the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. They claim to be the children and grandchildren of Palestinians who were descended from the original Palestinians and who were allegedly driven from their homes, businesses, and farms by the Israelis in the 1948 War of Independence. Backed by world opinion, the United Nations, the EU, and most world leaders, they demand a return to their native Palestine. In that 1948 war, Transjordan, which England had created in 1946 out of land that the 1922 Declaration of Principles of the League of Nations had recognized belonged to the Jewish people, took East Jerusalem. Some units of Jordan's Arab Legion were actually led by British commanders in the assault on Jerusalem. Jordan had launched an air attack against Israel even before it declared itself an independent state. Their heavy artillery and air bombardments were too much for the Jewish defenders, who had no artillery or warplanes. They surrendered the Jewish quarter of the Old City on May 28, 1948, losing their precious Western Wall 2 weeks after declaring themselves a nation. The Arabs had pounded the city with more than 10,000 shells, killing 1,200 civilians and destroying more than 2,000 homes. The poorly equipped Israelis bravely managed somehow to hang on to West Jerusalem. The Western Wall is generally called the Wailing Wall by non-Jews, a relatively new term. Israelis, however, insist upon the former name, and for good reasons. Writing in the Hebrew daily Haaretz, Israeli political and military analyst Zeev Shif explained, "What is the length of the Western Wall? Is it confined to the wall facing the space traditionally used by Jews for prayer, which is only 58 meters, or does it include the entire western retaining wall of the Temple Mount?" The Palestinians demand that any diplomatic settlement adhere to the shorter length, known as the Wailing Wall. Israel insists on the Western Wall, whose length is 485 meters. Transjordan, known as Jordan today, had been given more than 5 times as much of Palestine as Israel eventually was allotted. Greedy for more, its Arab legions took the West Bank, and Egypt took the Gaza Strip. All Jews were expelled, and all Jewish property was demolished or confiscated. This is standard procedure for Muslims whenever possible. Yet, the Arabs hypocritically demand that Jerusalem must continue as an international city for fear that Israel would eradicate Muslim holy sites, something they have never done to Islamic sites but that Muslims have always done to Jewish sites. Incredibly, the UN and world leaders make policy on the basis of Arab lies and in total disregard of established history. The 1993 Oslo Accords left Nablus, that's ancient Shechem, under Israeli jurisdiction. Located there was the traditional site of Joseph's tomb, a place dear not only to the heart of Israelis and of all Jews worldwide, but to Christians as well. On October 7, 2000, then Prime Minister Ehud Barak, relying upon a Palestinian agreement to protect the site, ordered Israeli troops to leave Nablus. Within hours, smoke was seen billowing from the tomb as a joyful mob celebrating Israeli withdrawal burned Jewish prayer books and other articles. With pickaxes and hammers, they began to tear apart the stone building. 2 days later, bulldozers were clearing the area. The UN and EU were silent at this desecration, but they continually thunder their denunciations of Israel for defending itself. Harbingers of peace? After the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, vacated Ramallah on January 3, 1996, Yasser Arafat, addressing the assembled mob of cheering Palestinians from the roof of the former IDF headquarters, declared that Ramallah and al-Birah have become liberated forever. Today we begin our path towards an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. This is what the peace process was all about for Arafat, and still is for Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, Arafat's successor as Palestinian Authority chairman and longtime partner in terrorism. Nothing has changed except that the rhetoric will be much smoother and more deceptive. The manner in which the IDF has departed each position that they have in good faith relinquished under signed agreements to their partner in peace, and the manner in which the Palestinians have taken over, unmasks the delusion of any desire for real peace. Consider the spectacle at the transfer of Nablus into the hands of Arafat's Palestinian Authority, or PA. The scenes on television showed departing Israeli soldiers cowering in their vehicles, being stoned, spat upon, and cursed. The raging mob, gleeful and power-intoxicated, burnt Israeli flags. It is difficult to imagine a more humiliating sight for Israel. The Nablus evacuation scenes reinforced the impression that it was only Arab force, not Israeli goodwill, which has compelled Israel to withdraw. Fatah, Arafat's own terrorist group, leaflets in Nablus hailed the Palestinian victory over the Nazi occupation army, boasting that it was the Palestinian fire which scorched the ground under the feet of the monkeys and pigs. The obvious conclusion is that the same fire can make Israel flee from the rest of Palestine. The West Bank and Gaza, so much in the news today, were held by Jordan and Egypt for 19 years and used as terrorist launching pads against Israel until the latter was forced, for its own protection, to occupy them in the Six-Day War in 1967. It was the Arabs, not Israel, who put the refugees in the camps and have kept them there ever since, instead of establishing them in their own Palestinian state, a lack of which the world blames upon Israel. The world that remained predictably silent when Jordan and Egypt confined the Palestinian refugees to camps and had no word of rebuke during the 19 years of terrorist attacks launched against Israel from these areas, now blames Israel for oppressing these peoples and clamors for Israel to end its unlawful occupation of Palestinian territory. In spite of the Palestine Liberation Organization's, or PLO's, obvious duplicity, Israel has continued to turn over territory to them, literally staging its own destruction, as the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel foretold. Have ye not seen a vain vision? The leaders have seduced my people, saying, peace, and there was no peace. The prophets prophesy concerning Jerusalem, visions of peace for her, and there is no peace, saith the Lord God. Is Israel committing suicide? In a news conference on December 27, 2004, PLO Chairman Mahmoud Abbas stressed the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, mainly the rights of refugees, to return back to Israel and to establish an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. Of course, no such state ever existed, so how could they return back to it? Nor did the Arabs ever suggest forming such a state when they had control of this area from 1948 to 1967. Why not? That is not their objective, but the destruction of Israel. It would be tantamount to national suicide for the small country of Israel with less than 8 million citizens, more than 1 million of them Arab Muslims who would love to see her destroyed, to allow within its borders another 4 million Arabs who have sworn her annihilation. This is the Arab goal in demanding a return of all refugees. And this is why President Bush has gone on record that the only right these, quote, refugees, unquote, have is to be received within their own independent Palestinian state formed out of present Palestinian territory, which his roadmap to peace is designed to create. Although the Palestinians pretend to be interested in negotiations brokered by Western powers to make peace in exchange for Israel giving up additional land, their ultimate aim is to possess all of Israel. That remains their unwavering determination today. Nor could they be satisfied with anything less without renouncing Islam and its founding prophet, Muhammad. The willful persistence in this illegitimate claim and its support by the rest of the world in the demand for a Palestinian state constitutes an inexcusable rejection of the clear testimony both of history and of Scripture. It is flagrant rebellion against the God of Israel. This triple crime has created the Mideast crisis facing us today. Not only the Muslims, but Western political leaders continue to defy the God of Israel. His patience is bound to wear thin, and that is a terrifying thought. Arab intentions. Under the assertion that they are descended from the original Palestinians who lived in the land of Palestine before the Israelites, led by Joshua, invaded and conquered it, the Arab refugees claim the entire land as theirs. The Jews, they insist, are unlawfully occupying their hereditary land and must leave. One repeatedly hears the complaint that the obstacle to peace is Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. If that is the case, why was the Palestine Liberation Organization created in 1964, when Israel had nothing to do with those territories which were then completely under Arab control? What did they intend to liberate when Jordan and Egypt held the Palestinians in their grip, whom they, not the Israelis, had put in squalid camps in these areas? Why did the PLO and her coterie of terrorists attack Israel from these territories and Hezbollah, Party of Allah, attack from Lebanon? There is only one answer. Talk of a Palestinian state is a smokescreen to cover the real intention of annihilating Israel. The Palestinians are mere pawns of the Arabs. The Arab armies that had attacked the new state of Israel in May 1948 were soundly defeated. They reluctantly signed temporary ceasefire agreements, allowed by Muhammad's example at Hudaybiyah in 628. Egypt on February 24, 1949, Lebanon on March 23rd, Transjordan on April 3rd, and Syria on July 20th. The borders of Israel agreed upon at that time have been known ever since as the Green Line. The victory had been costly. Israeli deaths had mounted to 6,373, 2,400 civilians, about 1% of her entire population, which would compare to a loss of nearly 3 million Americans today. Estimates of Arab losses vary from 5,000 to 15,000, about 1/40th of 1%. On October 11, 1949, Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs Mohammed Saleh el-Din declared that, quote, "The Arabs intend that they, that is the refugees, shall return as masters. More explicitly, they intend to annihilate the state of Israel. The Arab people will not be embarrassed to declare, we shall not be satisfied except by the final obliteration of Israel." End quote. Even Nazi Germany didn't intend to obliterate France or England, but this is what the Muslims intend for Israel. And the world blames Israel for not making peace with such enemies. Palestine. We have already seen that the land into which God brought Abraham some 4,000 years ago, which he promised by everlasting covenant to him and to his heirs, and in which he and his descendants, through Isaac and Jacob, lived for centuries thereafter, was not a non-existent place called Palestine, as those who erroneously call themselves Palestinians today insist. It was the historic land of Canaan. Quote, "And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. And I will be their God. Be ye mindful always of his covenant, which he made with Abraham, and of his oath unto Isaac, and hath confirmed the same to Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying, Unto thee will I give the land of Canaan." End quote. The ancient land of Canaan and its inhabitants are unmistakably identified, both in the Bible and by archaeology. Canaan was never promised to the Arabs, nor did they ever live there in any numbers until modern times. Canaan's early inhabitants were Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaims, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites, not Palestinians. When the Israelites returned after 400 years as slaves in Egypt, marking them as the promised heirs, they executed God's judgment upon an incredibly wicked people in conquering Canaan at God's command. Quote, "For the wickedness of these nations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee, not for thy righteousness." End quote. Canaan became Israel, and was so known for more than 1,500 years. But most of the world, and even most Israelis, call that land Palestine today. That has been its designation for centuries. If this was the land of Israel, when and how did it become known as Palestine? Around A.D. 132, the Romans, who had decimated Jerusalem in A.D. 70, began to rebuild it for Roman Emperor Hadrian as a pagan city dedicated to him and to Jupiter. They started construction of a temple to Jupiter on Temple Mount at the site of the ancient Jewish temple. Understandably, there was an uprising of the Jews to prevent such desecration. It was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom many at that time considered to be the Messiah. At first, the revolt was remarkably successful, but more legions were brought in, and the Romans eventually destroyed nearly 1,000 villages, killed about 500,000 Jews, and sold thousands into slavery. Jews, the Palestinians, who lived in the newly designated Palestine and were thus known as Palestinians. Jews, of course. Chased them out and they returned to the land God gave to their forebears. At that time, Arabs hadn't even dreamed that Palestine was their land. That ambition would not take hold for another 500 years until the advent of Islam. and even then, Arabs would not call themselves Palestinians. In World War II, Britain had a volunteer brigade known as the Palestinian Brigade. It was made up entirely of Jews. The Arabs were fighting on Hitler's side. Hitler had promised, in addition to the destruction of Israel, freedom and self-rule to all the Arab states in return for their assistance. One entire SS division was made up of Bosnian Muslims. There was the Palestinian Symphony Orchestra, a Jewish orchestra, and the Palestinian Post, a Jewish newspaper. As late as the 1950s, Arabs refused to be called Palestinians and declared that if there were such a people, they were Jews. To the British Peel Commission in 1937, a local Arab leader testified, quote, "There is no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term the Zionists invented." End of quote. Professor Philip Hitti, Arab historian, testified to an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in 1946, quote, "There is no such thing as Palestine in history, absolutely not." End of quote. To the UN Security Council on May 31, 1956, Ahmed Shukeri declared, quote, "It is common knowledge that Palestine is nothing but southern Syria." End of quote. 8 years later, in 1964, Shukeri became the founding chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization and coined the infamous slogan, quote, "We'll drive the Jews into the sea," end quote. And he wasn't even a Palestinian. Like Arafat, he was born in Cairo. The Palestine Liberation Organization was not founded by Palestinians, but has been used to exploit these abused people in Islam's war against Israel. Debunking the myth of Arab Palestinians. Today's Arab Palestinians are close relatives of the Arabs living in neighboring countries, from which most of them, or their immediate ancestors, came. They make a number of conflicting claims which, by their very absurdity, betray their illegitimacy. Even had there been a land of Palestine occupied by Palestinians, the Arabs could not have descended from them. Arabs claim that they are descended from Ishmael, Abraham's first son, and that they are therefore the legitimate heirs to the land that God gave to Abraham. They do have much Ishmaelite blood in them, but there is no direct genealogy tracing today's Arabs back to Ishmael. They are a mixed race. We've already seen that Isaac was the son of promise. Even if the Arabs were 100% Ishmaelites, they would still not be descended from the land's original inhabitants. God promised the land to Abraham before Ishmael was born. It already had many inhabitants, so how could Arab descendants of Ishmael, born to immigrants centuries after Canaan had been settled, be at the same time descendants of the original inhabitants of the Promised Land? Impossible. Ishmael himself was not descended from Canaan's original inhabitants. His father, Abraham, was from Ur of the Chaldees, and his mother, Hagar, was an Egyptian. Neither of them was among the original inhabitants of Canaan, nor even remotely related to such a people. Nor could any of Ishmael's descendants be so related. Today's Palestinians are promoting a lie. But it is a lie that the world loves and gladly uses as a club against Israel. Canaan was already settled when Abraham, with his wife Sarah and her maid Hagar, arrived there. At the age of 14, Ishmael, with his mother, banished by Sarah from Abraham's household, left Hebron and Canaan, and lived ever after in the wilderness of Paran. Ishmael's descendants never lived in Canaan, but settled in the Arabian Peninsula. It would not be until the 7th century A.D., through the Islamic jihad invasions, that Arabs would come in any significant numbers into the land of Israel, which by that time was erroneously called Palestine. How could the descendants of Ishmael, who didn't even live in Palestine, claim descent from the original Palestinians? They couldn't. Clearly, Arabs could not possibly be descendants of the original inhabitants of Canaan. Such contradictions do not provide a good foundation for the claims of today's Palestinians. Yet, the world accepts these fantasies as the basis of a settlement they intend to impose upon Israel, whose legitimate ancestral claims to that land go back 4,000 years. No relation to Philistines. If Palestine is so important to the Arabs, why is it not mentioned once in their holy book, the Quran? The word is used 4 times in the Bible, but never refers to the land of Canaan or to Israel. The Hebrew word from which it is translated is Pelensheth. It referred to a small region also known as Philistia, the land of the Pelishti or Philistines. Philistia was in the same location but a bit larger than the Gaza Strip of today, named after the Philistine city of Gaza. Their other cities were Ashdod, Gath, home of Goliath, Gerar, and Ekron. This is the true history of which the Quran knows nothing. The Philistines were not a Semitic people like the Arabs, but had invaded Canaan by sea from across the Mediterranean and occupied that particular area before the Israelites arrived. They were not the original inhabitants of the land as today's Palestinians claim their ancestors were, but displaced certain Canaanites just as they were themselves eventually displaced by Israel. Arab Palestinians, who are Semites, living there today can claim neither ethnic, linguistic, nor historical relationship to the Philistines, nor can they justify on any other basis calling themselves Palestinians. Those who today claim to be Palestinians are Arabs by birth, language, Islamic religion, and culture. Their Palestinian parents and grandparents immigrated from surrounding Arab countries, attracted by the prosperity being created by Jews returning to their ancient promised land. In most cases, this influx occurred only a few months or years before Israel declared independence. The United Nations defined a Palestinian as one who had lived there at least 2 years. Even that loose qualification was not strictly followed. Of course, this rule was generously applied to Arabs, but not to Jews, though they lived in Palestine as well. What about Jerusalem? Jerusalem was established as the capital of Israel by King David 3,000 years ago. As noted previously, it is not mentioned once in the Quran. Even when Muslim empires controlled all of the Middle East, Jerusalem was given no importance and was largely neglected. In the late 1800s, out of a population in Jerusalem of about 40,000, most were Jews, the rest Christians of various shades, and only a few were Arabs. Nor is there any reference to Jerusalem in the Palestine National Covenant of 1964. It was a new invention and complete turnabout when the Muslim world began to insist that the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem itself had always belonged to Palestinians. Muslim writers recently began to laud Jerusalem as comparable in holiness to Mecca and Medina, or even our most sacred place. But this was another fabrication and never the case historically. The Islamic terrorist organization Hezbollah, Party of Allah, headquartered in Syria, displays the Dome of the Rock on its promotional materials to inflame its followers against Israel. Arafat declared that Al-Quds, Jerusalem, is in the innermost of our feeling, the feeling of our people and the feeling of all Arabs, Muslims, and Christians in the world. Not surprisingly, he left out the Jews, to whom Jerusalem means more than to anyone. The PLO mentions Jerusalem in its 1968 Constitution as the seat of the Palestine Liberation Organization. It attempted to implement that fraudulent claim by establishing Palestinian Authority offices in Jerusalem's venerable Orient House, in violation of the Oslo Accords, where it conducted business and welcomed international delegates and peace activists. Finally, the Israelis had enough of the PLO's attempts to establish precedents legitimizing its claim to Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state. They ousted the PLO and took over Orient House and other PA offices in Jerusalem on August 10, 2001. At the very beginning, Muhammad made the Qibla, the direction of prayer, toward Jerusalem, apparently to attract the Jews. But when that ploy failed, he once again had Muslims pray facing Kaaba in Mecca, as they must today. Yet for the first 8 years, the Kaaba toward which Muslims prayed was filled with some 360 idols, of which the chief was Allah. Thus, the Quran not only does not mention Jerusalem, but by implication demeans it as the wrong Qibla. Quote, "And even if thou broughtest unto those who have received the Scripture, that is, Jews and Christians, they would not follow thy Qibla, nor canst thou be a follower of their Qibla. Then surely wert thou of the evildoers." End quote. Of course, Christians have no Qibla unless it is to lift up their eyes to heaven in prayer, as Jesus did. Yet, Palestinians demand the return of Jerusalem as their capital. In furtherance of the Palestinian myth, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia called on Muslim states to protect the holy city that belongs to all Muslims across the world. In fact, during the many centuries when one rival Muslim regime or another controlled Jerusalem, and even with the Dome of the Rock located there, it was never given any special significance in Islam. The current Muslim attempt to claim Jerusalem as an Islamic holy city would shock Muslims from centuries past. It is simply one more lie and one more ploy in the propaganda campaign to oust Israel. Its remarkable success will continue until Israelis are desperate enough to cry out as one voice for the Messiah to rescue them. And he will do so. A tangled web. There are many other problems with Palestinian claims. Of course, no one can unscramble eggs, but this is pretty much the situation. It was the UN that partitioned the land. Israel was content with what they received, although it was so narrow in some places as to be indefensible. They did not attack the Arabs. It was the Arabs who, in defiance of the United Nations, attacked Israel, and with the publicly stated and oft-repeated intention of annihilating her. Any territory Arabs lost from what the UN had allotted to them was taken by Israel in the process of defending itself from an enemy that had attacked with extermination in mind. Time magazine pointed out that had the Arabs not attacked but accepted the UN partition as Israel did, the Palestinians would have been living in their own state all these years. Of course, they never intended to accept any coexistence with Israel, as their leaders repeatedly vowed. And now, after 5 failed wars, they demand what the UN originally gave them. Surely Israel has no obligation to hand the original UN boundaries back to the Arabs, who violently rejected them and made them the basis of attempts to exterminate her. That would be a suicidal reward of aggression. It would be absurd for Israel to give back to her attackers the strategic territory she had to take in order to defend herself. Nevertheless, in a gesture unheard of in the history of war, victorious Israel has given back nearly 95% of the land she took in self-defense. And the Palestinians have persistently used that territory for launching terrorist attacks against their benefactor. Palestinians and terrorism. There is no reasoning with terrorists. Force is all they understand. Without question, the premier terrorist of recent years was Yasser Arafat, not Osama bin Laden. Born Abd al-Rahman Abd al-Rauf Arafat al-Qudwa el-Husseini on August 27, 1929, he shortened his name to omit the telltale al-Husseini. His main purpose was to hide his relationship to his grandfather's cousin, Haj Amin Muhammad al-Husseini, already referred to, who was appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem by the British in 1921. This Jew-killing partner of Hitler gave him $500,000 to fight the Allies and Jews, was a terrorist in his own right, and Arafat's mentor and guide. Arafat called himself Yasser in memory of Yasser al-Bara, a leader of the Grand Mufti's reign of terror in the 1930s. Arafat committed his first murder at age 20 of an innocent Palestinian, Rourke Hamid. The Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 1964, not in Palestine, but in Cairo, by Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's president, supposedly to represent the oppressed Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat, already the head of the terrorist group known as Fatah, became chairman of the PLO in 1969. Under Arafat, it became the wealthiest, with an annual income exceeding $1.2 billion, of which Arafat hid billions in his own personal Swiss accounts, and most vicious international terrorist organization on record. Involved in hundreds of bombings, shootings, hijackings, rocket attacks, and kidnappings in 26 countries. Most of the victims and more than 90% of the thousands of hostages were not Israelis. Negotiating with Arafat and the PLO was and is meaningless, yet Israel has been forced into that role by world opinion. The Palestinian National Charter of the PLO spells out their goals very clearly. These people are not extremists, but devout Muslims, so their goals are not merely that of their organization, but of their religion. Unless the religion changes, the goals cannot possibly change. In the process of negotiating with Israel for peace, they may pretend that they have changed, but that is simply not the case. Arafat ran the Palestinian territories like the royal family runs Saudi Arabia. There is no freedom. No one dared to disagree or even to question Arafat and his Palestinian authority. It will be even worse under the rule of Hamas. Voting will still be a joke. The press is controlled. An experienced Arab journalist wrote, quote, "Every journalist who wishes to interview a senior Palestinian official must be equipped with the following items: a casket, a burial plot for himself and his family, and a will prepared well in advance." End quote. Truth meant nothing to Arafat or his partners in crime, who, like communists have always done, invent history as they need it. Soviet dissidents had a saying that applies equally to the Palestinians. Quote, "The Soviet Union is the only country with an unpredictable past." End quote. The PLO National Charter reveals a perverse mindset. In the face of reams of history to the contrary, it dares to declare, and the world gladly believes such lies. Claims of historical or religious ties of Jews with Palestine are incompatible with the facts of history. Nor do Jews constitute a single nation with an identity of its own. They are citizens of the states to which they belong. Zionism is a political movement. Racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive, expansionist, and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Israel is a geographical base for world imperialism, placed strategically in the midst of the Arab homeland to combat the hopes of the Arab nation for liberation, unity, and progress. Israel is a constant source of threat vis-a-vis peace in the Middle East and the whole world. This is even worse than the pot calling the kettle black. Arafat died November 11, 2004. Palestinians wanted to bury him at the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Temple Mount, but Israel refused, careful to avoid giving their enemies any further claim to Israel's holiest site. As a compromise, amid a frenzied mob clamoring to touch the coffin, he was buried with high honor in Ramallah, where the PLO is headquartered. His body, however, was placed in a concrete coffin so that it could be moved to Al-Aqsa when Israel shall be finally ousted from the land. Almost immediately, world leaders came to pay their respects at this arch-criminal's grave. British Prime Minister Tony Blair did so in late December 2004, standing at a respectful distance. Among those laying wreaths at the tomb have been Italian Foreign Minister Giancarlo Fini and World Bank President James Wolfensohn. This is peace? Are the UN, EU, and world leaders such as Bush and Blair blind to the real intentions of the Arabs? That seems impossible, considering how often Arabs openly reiterate their determination to do away with Israel altogether. That peculiar definition of peace is stated clearly in the PLO Charter. Since the liberation of Palestine will destroy the Zionist and imperialist presence and will contribute to the establishment of peace in the Middle East, the Palestinian people look for the support of all the progressive and peaceful forces in their just struggle for the liberation of their homeland. When the PA took over Bethlehem just before Christmas 1995, Arafat helicoptered in and triumphantly addressed a wildly cheering mob of tens of thousands. Quote, "This is the birthplace of our Lord the Messiah, the Palestinian, the Palestinian," end quote. His speech made it appear that Jesus was a Palestinian freedom fighter against Israel. Yet, Pope John Paul II gladly accepted Arafat's invitation to join him in Bethlehem to celebrate our Jesus Christ. Our Jesus Christ? The Palestinian Jesus to whom he referred, Isa in the Quran, is not the Son of God who died for sin in our place. Someone died in Isa's place. Taken alive to heaven, he must return to die a natural death. Yet Arafat's misrepresentation of Jesus did not prevent the Pope from blessing the Palestinian fight for freedom. Islam and its Allah are notorious for their hatred of Israel and all Jews. Clearly, Allah is not the biblical God. The jealous hatred of Ishmael's descendants against the heirs of Isaac has left a blot on history unequaled even by Hitler. The Nazis were no less determined to exterminate all Jews than are the Muslims today, their partners in this Machiavellian goal during World War II. The Nazis did not, however, consider extermination of Jews a divine mandate, nor did Hitler offer a paradise of perpetual sex with hundreds of virgins, as did Muhammad, to those who died in the process of slaughtering Jews. The Nazis simply went about the gruesome task methodically, as one would exterminate cockroaches or rats from one's house. With the Nazis, it was a science. With the Muslims, however, Jew extermination is a religious ritual that pleases Allah, is the subject of fervent prayers in the mosque, and offers great rewards here and in the hereafter. Nothing so clearly exposes the lie that terrorists are extremists who give Islam a bad name as the high esteem with which murderers of Jews are held by Muslims everywhere. Beloved throughout the Islamic world, Sheikh Abdul Rahman al-Sudais, Imam of Mecca's Grand Mosque, is one example. On October 23, 2005, he was honored as the Islamic Personality of the Year at the Dubai International Holy Quran Awards. In his acceptance speech, he boasted, "The message of Islam and Muslims is fairness, sympathy, harmony, and kindness." Yet at Mecca's Grand Mosque before 2 million Muslims, al-Sudais prayed to Allah to terminate the Jews and describe them as the scum of humanity, the rats of the world, pigs and monkeys. His appeal to Arabs and Muslims everywhere to abandon peace initiatives with Israel was carried worldwide by Reuters and the Associated Press. No one, certainly no Muslim, called him an extremist who was giving Islam a bad name. He was cheered by the entire Islamic world as a leader with an honorable history in serving Islam and Muslims. The haunting, terrifying image of handcuffed New Jersey-born Daniel Pearl, Phi Beta Kappa from Stanford, gun to his head, a gentle father-to-be who loved life and pursued truth worldwide as a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, pops unbidden into one's mind. His Muslim captors made a snuff video to show their handiwork to the world. He seems almost relaxed, exuding goodwill, as he obeys in confessing that he is a Jew. Suddenly, his throat is slit, his head severed and defiantly displayed, raised again and again. "I am a Jew." The words echoing across the slain and mutilated bodies strewn through 1,300 years of Islamic history seem to come not only from Pearl's lips, but from millions of others. Gradually, the sickening truth emerges. This is what Palestine is all about. A cry of outrage bursts from one's throat. Then silence. No one is listening. Please visit our website, thebereancall.org, to access our radio archives going back to 1999 and our newsletter going back to 1986. We offer daily updates by email or visit us on Facebook or Twitter. Are you looking for information about a specific topic? Go to thebereancall.org and click on Topics at the top of the page. Our online store is thebereancall.com. We offer a wide variety of books, tracts, CDs, and DVDs. Note that most of our ebooks are free. I'm Gary Carmichael. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you can join us again next week. Until then, we encourage you to search the Scriptures 24/7.
Though none go with me, I still will follow. No turning back, no turning back.